Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, a quiet place where curiosity slows its breathing and questions are allowed to wander without needing to arrive anywhere in particular. This is a space for long thoughts, soft explanations, and stories that unfold at their own pace, the kind you can listen to while the day loosens its grip and the night begins to settle in. Tonight, we're turning our attention far north, toward a place that appears on maps as a vast pale shape, but in reality feels much larger than any outline could suggest. Alaska is often described as wild, remote, unforgiving, and beautiful, sometimes all in the same sentence. It's a land of long distances and quiet stretches where roads end without apology and weather arrives without warning. It's a place where you can travel for hours and see nothing but trees, mountains, water and sky, uninterrupted and unmoved by human presence. And within this already immense and mysterious region, there is an area that has gathered a particular reputation over the decades. A loose shape, not officially marked, not fenced or signed, but talked about quietly and persistently. A place known as the Alaska Triangle. The name itself sounds a little dramatic, as if borrowed from somewhere warmer and more ocean-bound, but the stories attached to it are anything but tropical. They are cold, spare, and often unfinished. Aircraft that vanished without distress calls, people who set out on routine journeys and never arrived, search efforts that covered enormous ground and returned with nothing more than questions and silence. No clear villains, no tidy explanations, just absence, stretched across snowfields, forests, and empty air. Now, before we go any further, it might be worth pausing for a moment. Where are you listening from tonight? Is it late where you are, or early? Are you settled somewhere familiar, or passing through a place that still feels slightly temporary? It's interesting to think about, especially when the subject itself revolves around location, distance, and the strange things that can happen when people move through spaces much larger than themselves. If you find this kind of slow exploration calming, or if you enjoy listening to ideas unfold without urgency, you might consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. It helps this small, quiet corner reach others who may also be looking for something thoughtful to end their day with. And now, with that said, we can begin easing into the story itself. The Alaska Triangle is not a formally defined region. There are no official borders, no coordinates you can plug neatly into a GPS. Instead, it's usually described as a rough shape formed between three locations: Anchorage, Juneau, and Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow. Draw lines between those points, and you get a massive area covering much of Alaska's interior and southern regions, an area so large that entire countries could fit inside it several times over, an area where population density drops quickly once you leave a handful of cities and towns behind. What makes this region stand out isn't just its size, but the number of disappearances associated with it. Over the years, thousands of people have been reported missing in Alaska, and a significant portion of those cases fall within this triangular area. That statistic alone sounds alarming, but it needs context. Alaska is huge. Travel often involves small planes rather than roads. Weather conditions can change rapidly. Search and rescue operations face challenges that don't exist in more densely populated places. Still, even with all of that taken into account, some cases resist explanation in ways that linger uncomfortably. There are planes that vanished from radar and were never located despite extensive searches. Not even debris. There are experienced outdoorsmen who understood the land and its risks, who carried supplies, who told people where they were going, and who still disappeared. There are moments where tracking dogs lost scent abruptly, or where search grids were flown and walked repeatedly with nothing to show for it. In a world saturated with surveillance satellites and data, there are still places where someone can go missing and leave almost no trace behind. To understand why this happens, or at least why it might happen, You have to start with the land itself. Alaska does not behave like most places. Distances are deceptive. What looks manageable on a map can translate into days of difficult travel on the ground. Forests are dense and repetitive, making navigation disorienting even for experienced hikers. Mountains rise sharply, often cloaked in cloud cover that can hide them until you are far too close. Rivers swell, freeze, break apart, and change course depending on the season. Then there is the weather, which does not gradually announce its arrival. Storms can form quickly, especially in mountainous regions where air currents collide. Fog can roll in thick enough to erase the horizon entirely. Winds can shift without warning, turning a stable flight into a dangerous one within minutes. Temperatures can drop suddenly, pushing conditions from uncomfortable to life-threatening faster than the body can adjust. For pilots, especially those flying small aircraft, Alaska demands constant attention. Many communities are only accessible by air, and bush pilots often operate in conditions that would ground flights elsewhere. They rely on experience, instinct, and a deep familiarity with local weather patterns. Even so, things can go wrong. Instruments can fail. Visibility can vanish. Magnetic anomalies, which we'll return to later, can interfere with navigation. And when a plane goes down in this environment, finding it is not guaranteed. Search efforts face enormous obstacles. Dense forests can conceal wreckage from above. Snowfall can bury debris within hours. Mountain terrain creates blind spots where signals don't travel and sightlines are limited. If a crash occurs in a remote area, there may be no witnesses, no immediate clues, and no easy way to narrow down the location. Time works against both rescuers and survivors, especially in colder months. But it isn't only planes that vanish, people do too. Hunters, hikers, researchers, children, seasoned adventurers, and casual travellers have all been reported missing in this region. Some cases have partial explanations. Accidents happen. Wildlife encounters are rare but real. Exposure is a constant threat. Yet there are instances where the circumstances don't line up neatly with what was found, or rather, with what wasn't found. In some stories, a person disappears from a group without anyone noticing the exact moment. In others, someone steps away briefly and doesn't return. There are reports of footprints that end abruptly, as if the person simply stopped existing at that point. These details tend to grow in the retelling, of course, shaped by memory, fear and speculation, but they persist because they touch on something deeply unsettling. The idea that a human being can vanish into the environment without explanation, leaving behind unanswered questions that remain unanswered for decades. It's tempting to reach for extraordinary explanations when faced with these gaps. People talk about strange forces, unknown creatures, or hidden phenomena. The human mind dislikes uncertainty, and when ordinary answers feel insufficient, imagination fills the space. But before drifting too far into speculation, it's worth sitting with the simpler, if still uncomfortable reality. This is a place where the margin for error is thin, and the consequences of mistakes are severe. Even experienced locals speak of Alaska with a kind of respectful caution. It is not a land that can be dominated or fully understood. It allows passage, sometimes generously, sometimes not at all. Survival depends on preparation, humility, and an acceptance that plans may need to change without notice. Those who underestimate it often don't get a second chance. At the same time, there is something about this environment that draws people in. The scale of it, the quiet, the sense that you are standing inside something much older and much larger than human systems. For some, that feeling is grounding. For others, it's unsettling. Perhaps it's both at once, and it's within that emotional tension that the stories of the Alaska Triangle continue to live. As we move forward, we'll spend time with specific cases, patterns, and explanations, both scientific and cultural. We'll look at what has been documented, what remains unclear, and why certain disappearances stay lodged in public memory while others fade quietly away. We'll talk about the role of environment, technology, and human decision-making without rushing to conclusions or trying to force everything into a single narrative. For now, it's enough to sit with the setting itself, a vast northern landscape where distance stretches time, where silence is common, and where going missing is not always dramatic but often quiet and unnoticed until much later. A place where even today, with all our tools and tracking systems, there are still corners that remain largely unobserved. And as we continue, it becomes clear that to understand what goes missing inside the Alaska Triangle, we first have to understand what kind of place allows things to disappear at all. If you try to ask where the Alaska Triangle begins, you'll notice something unusual almost immediately. There is no sign, no marker, no official line that tells you you've crossed into it. No map legend explains it neatly. You don't drive into it and feel a sudden shift under the tyres. Instead, it begins quietly, almost invisibly, the way many unsettling things do. One moment you're in Alaska, and the next you're still in Alaska, but somehow the scale of everything starts to feel heavier, less forgiving, as if the land itself has stopped accommodating human expectations. Most descriptions trace the Alaska Triangle between three distant points: Anchorage in the south-central region, Juneau along the southeastern panhandle, and Utqiagvik far to the north on the Arctic coast. When you draw those lines, you enclose an area so large it's difficult to process intuitively. It's not a pocket or a corridor. It's an enormous stretch of wilderness, mountains, rivers, tundra, forests, and sky. Inside that shape are long distances without roads, settlements that rely on plains rather than highways, and vast regions where human presence is sparse enough that it barely registers on the landscape. But geography alone doesn't explain why this area feels different. After all, much of Alaska's remote. What sets this region apart is not just how empty it is, but how inconsistently it behaves. Travel through it is rarely straightforward. The same route can feel manageable one day and hostile the next. Weather shifts abruptly. Navigation becomes unreliable. Familiar reference points disappear, either hidden by terrain or erased by fog, snow, or darkness. Anchorage, often described as Alaska's largest city, sits at the southern edge of this rough triangle. From there, roads stretch outward for a while, giving the impression of accessibility. But that illusion doesn't last long. Drive north or east, and the infrastructure thins out. Highways narrow, fuel stops become infrequent. Cell service drops away in patches, then vanishes altogether. Even before reaching truly remote areas, you start to feel how quickly support systems fade. Juneau, another corner of the triangle, isn't accessible by road at all. You reach it by plane or by sea. That alone sets a tone. A city that depends entirely on weather and transportation schedules that can be disrupted without warning exists on a different rhythm. Flights are delayed not just by storms, but by visibility, wind patterns, and icing conditions that can ground even experienced pilots. When you leave Juneau and head inland, the terrain rises sharply into mountains and dense forest. There are places where even short distances become complicated because the land refuses to cooperate. Far to the north, Utqiagvik marks another edge, where the environment becomes even more extreme. Here the ground freezes solid for much of the year. The sun disappears for months at a time in winter, and in summer it refuses to set. This disruption of day and night affects not only human sleep cycles, but perception itself. Time behaves differently when there is no clear boundary between morning and evening. Orientation becomes more mental than visual. Fatigue creeps in quietly. Within these boundaries lies an interior that resists simplification. Mountain ranges intersect with river systems that twist and braid unpredictably. Glaciers carve paths that look stable until they shift. Forests repeat the same patterns over and over, making it easy to lose a sense of direction even when you believe you're moving deliberately. Snowfall smooths the landscape, erasing tracks, landmarks, and evidence within hours. One reason this region feels different is that it does not offer the usual visual cues humans rely on. In many places, you can orient yourself by buildings, roads, signs, or changes in land use. Inside much of the Alaska Triangle, those cues are absent. The land looks the same in every direction. Trees blend together. Hills rise and fall without distinct features. Even rivers can mislead, because they split and rejoin, creating loops rather than clear paths. Another factor is how quickly conditions change. In temperate regions, weather often announces itself. Clouds gather slowly. Temperatures shift over hours. In this part of Alaska, changes can occur in minutes. Clear skies can collapse into thick fog. Calm air can turn turbulent. A route that was safe on the way in may be impassable on the way out. This unpredictability creates a constant low-level tension, even for those who know the land well. There's also the issue of scale. Distances in Alaska are deceptive. A point that looks close on a map may represent hours of travel by air or days on foot. When something goes wrong, help is rarely nearby. Search and rescue teams may need to cover hundreds of square miles, often with limited visibility. Even when the approximate location of a missing person or aircraft is known, reaching it can take time the situation does not allow. Magnetic irregularities add another layer of complication. Alaska sits closer to the magnetic North Pole than most inhabited regions, and this affects compasses and navigation systems. Pilots and hikers have reported compass readings that behave erratically, especially in certain areas. While modern GPS systems mitigate some of these issues, they are not immune to interference, signal loss, or technical failure. When electronic systems fail, people fall back on instinct and experience, which can be compromised by stress, fatigue, and environmental conditions. The land also absorbs sound in unusual ways. Snow, trees, and open spaces can muffle noise, making it difficult to locate others by calling out or listening for engines or footsteps. In dense forest or heavy snowfall, sound doesn't travel far or predictably. This contributes to the eerie silence often described in disappearance cases, where searchers report an unsettling quiet, broken only by wind or distant water. Culturally, this region carries a sense of respect mixed with caution. Indigenous communities have lived here for thousands of years, and their stories often emphasize balance, awareness, and humility in the face of nature. The land is not framed as hostile, but as indifferent. It does not act with intent, but it does not adjust itself for human safety either. Those who survive here do so by learning its rhythms, not by trying to impose their own. Modern visitors sometimes underestimate this difference. Experience in other wilderness areas does not always translate. Skills that work in temperate forests or deserts may fall short here. Cold changes everything. Equipment behaves differently. Batteries drain faster. Metal becomes brittle. Simple injuries become serious when movement is restricted by snow or ice. The Alaska Triangle also feels different because of how little margin for error it allows. In many places, a wrong turn is an inconvenience. Here, it can be fatal. A missed landing window, a delayed pickup, a decision to push forward instead of turning back. These moments don't always announce themselves as dangerous at the time. They only become obvious in hindsight if there is one. Another subtle factor is psychological. Vast empty spaces can affect the mind. Isolation changes perception. Without familiar sounds and sights, people can become disoriented more easily. Fatigue sets in differently when the environment offers no sense of progress or destination. The monotony of similar landscapes can blur time and distance, leading people to overestimate how far they've travelled or how long they've been exposed. Inside this region, communication is fragile. Radios depend on line of sight. Satellite phones require clear access to the sky. Mountains, trees, and weather can interfere with both. When communication fails, people are alone in a very literal sense. There is no quick way to call for help, no guarantee that anyone knows precisely where you are. All of this contributes to the feeling that this place operates by different rules. Not supernatural ones, but environmental ones that are unfamiliar and unforgiving. When something goes missing here, it doesn't feel like an anomaly. It feels like a consequence of entering a system that does not prioritize human survival, and yet the land is not constantly threatening. There are long stretches of calm, beauty, and stillness. Clear days where mountains stand sharply against the sky, rivers that move gently, wildlife that keeps its distance. These moments can lull people into a sense of comfort. It's often during these calm periods that people let their guard down, assuming conditions will remain stable. That contrast is part of what makes the Alaska Triangle feel unsettling. It doesn't present itself as dangerous all the time. It shifts between welcoming and indifferent, between manageable and overwhelming. That inconsistency makes it difficult to predict and even harder to fully respect, especially for those who haven't spent years learning its patterns. As stories of disappearances accumulated over decades, this region took on a reputation that extends beyond statistics. The name itself became a shorthand for unanswered questions, not because something unnatural was happening, but because the environment repeatedly demonstrated its ability to erase evidence, disrupt plans, and leave investigators with gaps they couldn't fill. When you stand back and look at it, the Alaska Triangle begins wherever infrastructure ends and uncertainty takes over. It begins when roads thin out, when weather becomes the dominant force, when navigation requires constant attention, and when mistakes are not easily corrected. It begins not at a line on a map, but at the moment when the land stops adapting to you and expects you to adapt to it. And as we continue, moving deeper into specific cases and patterns, that sense of difference becomes more pronounced. Because once you understand how this region behaves, it becomes easier to see why so much has gone missing here, and why even now so many answers remain just out of reach. There is a particular kind of distance that doesn't show up clearly on maps. It isn't measured in miles or kilometers, and it doesn't care how advanced your tools are. It's the distance between what can be seen and what can be watched. Alaska, especially within the bounds of the Alaska Triangle, exists largely inside that gap. It is not just big. It is too big to monitor continuously, too big to supervise in any meaningful way, and too big to guarantee that every movement through it will be noticed or recorded. When people hear that Alaska is large, they often understand it abstractly. They know it's bigger than Texas. They know it takes hours to fly across. But abstraction doesn't prepare you for what that scale actually means on the ground or in the air. Vast areas of Alaska have no permanent residents, no cameras, no regular patrols, no cell towers, no roads. There are places where weeks pass without a single human being entering a particular valley, ridge, or stretch of forest. Not because it's forbidden, but because there is simply no reason to go there unless you are intentionally seeking isolation. This lack of constant presence has consequences. In most populated regions, movement leaves a trail. Cameras catch vehicles, phones ping towers. Someone notices something out of place. In the Alaska Triangle, movement often goes unobserved. A person can enter the wilderness and effectively step outside the network of systems that normally track human activity. Once that happens, there is no invisible safety net waiting below. Search and rescue teams know this better than anyone. Even with modern aircraft, satellite imagery, and coordinated efforts, they're often working with incomplete information. A last known location might cover dozens or hundreds of square miles. Weather may have changed the terrain since the disappearance occurred. Snow can fall, rivers can rise, tracks can vanish. In many cases, there is no clear starting point, only a rough estimate and a ticking clock. The challenge isn't just finding something small in a big place, it's finding something that may no longer exist in the same form. A plane crash may scatter debris across miles of rugged terrain. A person may move far from their original location, Intentionally or unintentionally, injuries, fear, and confusion can push people in unpredictable directions. In a landscape without clear boundaries, those movements become harder to reconstruct. Aerial searches, which are often the first response, have their own limitations. Dense forest canopy can hide wreckage completely. Snow cover smooths out visual irregularities. Shadows from mountains can obscure details even in clear weather. From above, the land often looks uniform, offering few clues that something is wrong. A crashed aircraft can blend into the terrain so thoroughly that it remains invisible unless you know exactly where to look. On foot, the problem becomes one of endurance and logistics. Teams can only cover so much ground each day. Terrain slows progress. Weather dictates schedules. Safety considerations limit where and how long searchers can operate. In extreme conditions, the search itself becomes dangerous, forcing teams to pull back even when answers remain elusive. This is not a failure of effort or commitment. It is a consequence of scale. Alaska does not yield easily to systematic observation. There are simply too many places to look and not enough time, resources, or people to watch them all closely. That imbalance creates gaps, and within those gaps, things disappear. The vastness also affects prevention. In more monitored environments, warnings are issued quickly, hazards are marked, routes are regulated. In Alaska, especially away from major population centres, individuals are responsible for their own safety to a much greater degree. There is an expectation of self-reliance that comes with an unspoken understanding. If something goes wrong, help may not arrive quickly, if at all. This expectation shapes behaviour, sometimes in risky ways. People push limits because they have to. Flights operate in marginal conditions because communities depend on them. Hunters and workers venture far from support because that is where the work is. There is no alternative that is both safe and practical. Risk becomes normalised, not because it is ignored, but because avoiding it entirely would mean not living there at all. The land's sheer size also distorts perception of time. Distances that look manageable on a map translate into hours or days of travel. A delay of a few hours can mean missing a weather window. A missed check-in can escalate from mildly concerning to critical before anyone realises it. By the time a search begins, the window for finding someone alive may already be closing. Another complication is how rarely some areas are revisited. In many disappearance cases, even if something was left behind, it may remain undiscovered simply because no one passes through that exact location again. Trails are informal or non-existent. Rivers change course. Seasonal access means that some areas are only reachable for short periods each year. A missing person's last location might not be revisited for years, if ever. Technology helps, but only to a point. Satellites can cover wide areas, but resolution has limits. They can miss small details. They cannot see through dense forest or thick cloud cover. GPS tracking is only useful if a device is present, powered and functional. When batteries fail or signals drop, the trail goes cold. There is also the issue of noise versus silence. In heavily populated areas, unusual events stand out. A crash is heard. A fire is seen. In Alaska's wilderness, sound dissipates. Visual cues are swallowed by distance and terrain. An accident can occur without anyone nearby to notice. By the time signs appear, they may already be altered or erased by the environment. This creates a strange imbalance between modern capability and ancient reality. Humans have developed extraordinary tools for observation and communication, yet there are still places where those tools barely reach. The Alaska Triangle exists largely in that space. It is not hidden, but it is underobserved. Not mysterious in a supernatural sense, but opaque due to practical limitations. The vastness also shapes how stories are remembered. When something goes missing and is never found, the absence itself becomes part of the narrative. Questions linger because there is nothing concrete to replace them. Over time, these unresolved cases accumulate, giving the impression of a pattern even when individual circumstances differ. The land size allows these stories to remain open-ended. It's important to note that many disappearances in Alaska are eventually explained. Wreckage is found years later when glaciers recede or when construction uncovers buried remains. Bones surface after snow melts. Equipment is discovered by chance. These findings remind us that disappearance does not always mean vanishing without cause. Often it means vanishing without witnesses. But there are cases where even time does not bring answers. No remains, no debris, no credible clues. These are the cases that define the Alaska Triangle in the public imagination. They persist not because they are common, but because they resist closure. The land's vastness allows them to stay unresolved indefinitely. This inability to watch closely also affects accountability. In most places, accidents are investigated thoroughly, causes are identified, regulations are adjusted. In Alaska, investigations sometimes end with uncertainty. There is not always enough information to determine exactly what happened. That lack of resolution can be deeply unsettling, especially for families. Yet, for those who live there, this reality is accepted with a kind of quiet understanding. The land does not promise safety. It offers opportunity, beauty and freedom, but not guarantees. Living within it means accepting that not everything can be controlled or observed. As we move forward, examining specific disappearances and recurring patterns, this idea remains central. The Alaska Triangle is not defined by a single cause or phenomenon. It is defined by scale, by distance, by the simple fact that there are places so large, so empty, and so indifferent that even in an age of constant connectivity, they remain beyond close watch. And within that space, the line between known and unknown stays thin, flexible, and often invisible. Flying in Alaska carries a different weight than flying almost anywhere else. The sky is larger, the distance is longer, and the margin for error narrower. In many parts of the state, aircraft are not a luxury or a convenience. They are a necessity. Planes connect villages with hospitals, deliver supplies, transport workers, and move people across terrain that has no roads and likely never will. This reliance on aviation is one of the reasons Alaska has more pilots per capita than any other US state. It is also one of the reasons aircraft disappearances feature so prominently in stories associated with the Alaska Triangle. When a plane vanishes here, it rarely does so in dramatic fashion. There is often no mayday call, no final message, no clear indication that something went wrong. A flight departs as scheduled. Weather appears manageable, the pilot is experienced, and then the aircraft simply fails to arrive. Hours pass, communication attempts go unanswered. Eventually concern turns into a search, and the sky that once seemed like a route becomes an obstacle. To understand why planes go missing in this region, it helps to understand how different Alaskan flying is from commercial aviation elsewhere. Many flights operate at lower altitudes, in smaller aircraft, and under visual flight rules rather than relying entirely on instruments. Pilots read the landscape constantly, using mountains, rivers, coastlines, and weather patterns as guides. This demands skill and focus, but it also means that visibility is critical. When that visibility disappears, even briefly, the consequences can escalate quickly. Weather is the most obvious factor, but it is also the most misunderstood. In Alaska, weather is not a single condition spread evenly across large areas. It is fragmented, layered, and often localized. Clear skies at one end of a route can coexist with dense fog, icing, or turbulence at another. Mountains create their own systems, forcing air upward, generating clouds, and producing sudden wind shifts. A pilot can fly into a wall of cloud with little warning, losing all visual reference points. Once visual cues are gone, spatial disorientation becomes a serious risk. The human brain relies heavily on the horizon to determine orientation. Without it, the inner ear can send misleading signals. Pilots can feel as though they are flying level when they are not. They may perceive climbing as descending or vice versa. This phenomenon has contributed to many aviation accidents worldwide, but in Alaska, the lack of clear escape routes makes recovery more difficult. Icing is another persistent threat. Moist air combined with freezing temperatures can cause ice to form on wings, propellers, and control surfaces. This changes how air flows over the aircraft, reducing lift and increasing drag. In small planes, even a thin layer of ice can be dangerous. Instruments may indicate normal performance until the situation becomes critical. In remote areas, there may be no nearby airport to divert to once icing begins. Then there is the terrain itself. Alaska's mountains are not gentle slopes. They rise steeply and often without warning. Cloud cover can obscure them completely. A pilot flying through what appears to be open space can suddenly find the ground rushing up. Controlled flight into terrain is a known risk, especially in areas where navigation depends on visual landmarks that are temporarily hidden. Fuel planning also plays a role. Long distances between airstrips mean flights must be carefully calculated. Unexpected headwinds, rerouting around weather, or holding patterns while waiting for conditions to improve can eat into fuel reserves. In regions where emergency landing options are limited or non-existent, running low on fuel becomes more than an inconvenience. When a plane does go down in Alaska, locating it is not guaranteed. The sky may be endless, but the ground below is complex. Dense forests can swallow wreckage whole. Snowfall can cover debris before search efforts even begin. If a crash occurs on a glacier, the aircraft may become buried and carried away slowly over time, emerging decades later, or not at all. Water presents another challenge. Lakes, rivers, and coastal areas are common flight paths. An aircraft that crashes into water may sink quickly, especially if it breaks apart on impact. Cold temperatures reduce survival time, and currents can move wreckage far from the initial crash site. Sonar searches are expensive, time-consuming, and not always feasible in remote locations. Search and rescue operations face difficult decisions. They must balance urgency with safety. Flying search patterns in poor weather risks additional accidents. Ground teams can only cover limited areas. Resources are finite. As days pass without leads, searches are scaled back, then suspended. At that point, the sky returns to its usual role, wide and indifferent, holding whatever answers it contains. Some of the most unsettling cases involve flights that should have been easy. Short routes, clear forecasts, routine operations. These are the disappearances that challenge assumptions and fuel speculation. When experienced pilots and well-maintained aircraft vanish under seemingly favourable conditions, it becomes harder to point to a single obvious cause. However, aviation experts caution against assuming mystery where complexity is sufficient. Small planes operate close to the edge of environmental tolerance in Alaska. Minor issues can cascade. A faulty instrument, a momentary lapse, a sudden weather shift. These do not always leave clear signatures in the wreckage, especially when that wreckage is never found. There are documented cases where missing aircraft were discovered years later in places that had been searched multiple times. Changes in vegetation, melting ice, or sheer chance revealed what had been hidden. These discoveries often confirm that accidents occurred, even if they cannot reconstruct every detail. They serve as reminders that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially in a landscape that constantly reshapes itself. Still, some cases remain unresolved. No wreckage, no remains, no credible theories that satisfy everyone involved. These are the stories that linger. They are retold not because they defy physics, but because they defy closure. Families are left without answers. Investigators are left with open files. The sky becomes a symbol of uncertainty rather than freedom. It is tempting to imagine that something unusual is happening in these endless skies, that there is a pattern beyond chance. But when examined closely, the factors involved are numerous and overlapping. Weather, terrain, human limits, mechanical vulnerability, and sheer scale combine in ways that challenge even the best systems. Flying in Alaska is often described as beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Pilots speak of moments when the world opens up beneath them, endless and pristine. They also speak of moments when that same openness feels hostile, offering nowhere to hide and no room for error. The sky is not empty. It is full of variables, many of them invisible until it is too late. As aviation technology improves, some risks diminish. Better weather forecasting, more reliable GPS, satellite tracking, and emergency locator beacons all increase the chances of survival and recovery. But they do not eliminate risk entirely. Batteries fail, signals are blocked, equipment is damaged in crashes. Even the most advanced systems rely on infrastructure that may not exist in remote areas. The Alaska Triangle remains a region where aviation operates at the intersection of necessity and danger. Planes continue to fly because they must. Pilots continue to train and adapt. Search teams continue to respond. And occasionally, despite all of this, an aircraft disappears into the endless sky and does not return. These disappearances are not evidence of a hostile force or a hidden phenomenon. They are reminders of how small human machines are when set against a landscape that does not bend easily. They show how quickly control can slip away when conditions change, and how fragile the thread of connection can be once a plane leaves the ground. As we move forward, shifting attention from aircraft to the people who travel on foot through this region, the same themes will reappear. Scale, isolation, unpredictability. The sky may swallow planes, but the land below has its own way of erasing those who move through it, quietly and without ceremony. There is something particularly unsettling about disappearances that happen on foot. A plane vanishing into the sky carries an inherent sense of drama and distance. People expect aviation to involve risk, technology, and variables beyond direct human control. But when someone walks out under their own power and never returns, the disappearance feels closer, more personal, harder to rationalize. In the Alaska Triangle, these cases form a quiet, troubling pattern. Individuals leave cabins, camps, vehicles, or small settlements, often for ordinary reasons, and then simply fail to come back. Many of these people were not reckless. They were hunters following familiar routes, researchers collecting data, workers checking equipment, or residents stepping outside to attend to routine tasks. Some were highly experienced outdoorsmen with years of knowledge about the land. Others were visitors who believed they were prepared. What unites their stories is not foolishness or bravado, but the speed at which ordinary situations can unravel in an environment that does not tolerate misjudgment. In Alaska, walking even short distances carries risks that are easy to underestimate. Trails are often informal, marked more by habit than signage. Snow can obscure paths entirely. Forests repeat themselves visually, making it easy to lose a sense of direction. A person who steps off a known route, even briefly, can find it surprisingly difficult to reorient. Trees block sightlines, hills conceal landmarks. The ground itself offers few clear clues about where you've been or where you should go next. Once disorientation sets in, decision-making becomes compromised. People tend to keep moving, believing they will eventually recognize something familiar. In reality, this often takes them farther from their starting point. Panic doesn't always arrive suddenly. It can creep in slowly, disguised as urgency or determination. By the time someone realizes they are truly lost, they may already be exhausted, cold, or injured. Weather amplifies these risks. A clear day can shift quickly, reducing visibility and dropping temperatures. Wind chill accelerates heat loss. Rain or snow soaks clothing, sapping body warmth. Hypothermia does not announce itself clearly. It dulls thinking, reduces coordination, and creates a false sense of calm. People in its grip may make choices that seem irrational from the outside, including abandoning shelter or discarding equipment. Search and rescue teams frequently encounter this pattern. A missing person's belongings are found neatly arranged or scattered in ways that suggest confusion rather than struggle. Footprints may lead away from safety instead of toward it. Sometimes tracks simply stop, erased by snowfall or terrain. In these moments, the land does not provide explanations, it absorbs them. One of the most difficult aspects of these cases is how quickly a situation can turn from manageable to fatal. A short walk to check a trap line, a brief hike to scout terrain, a momentary separation from a group. These are not actions that feel dangerous at the time. They become dangerous only in hindsight, when the sequence of small decisions is reconstructed without the pressure and fatigue that shaped them. Wildlife is often mentioned in discussions of disappearances, but actual attacks are rare. Bears and wolves generally avoid humans. When encounters do occur, they are usually brief and well documented. The fear of wildlife often distracts from more common threats: exposure, injury, exhaustion, and disorientation. These are quieter dangers. They do not leave dramatic evidence behind. In some cases, people are last seen behaving normally. They wave goodbye. They mention where they're going. They express no concern. This normalcy makes their absence harder to accept. Families search for reasons that feel proportionate to the outcome, but often there are none. The environment does not escalate gradually. It flips conditions suddenly, and once that happens, the window for self-rescue closes quickly. There are also instances involving children, which carry a particular emotional weight. Young people wander away from campsites or homes and vanish within minutes. Search efforts mobilize rapidly, covering ground in expanding circles. Dogs are brought in. Helicopters sweep overhead. And still, nothing is found. In these cases, the land's ability to hide becomes almost incomprehensible. How can someone so small, so close, simply disappear? Part of the answer lies in how the environment interacts with scale. A child can fit into spaces adults overlook: dense brush, shallow water, uneven ground. Even in open areas, distance distorts perception. A figure visible at one moment can vanish behind a rise or into tree cover the next. Without constant visual contact, separation becomes final. Cultural expectations also play a role. In Alaska, independence is valued. People are accustomed to managing their own risks. This self-reliance is necessary, but it can delay alarm. A person missing for several hours may not trigger immediate concern if delays are common. By the time worry turns into action, conditions may have changed dramatically. Search efforts, while dedicated and often heroic, face structural limits. Teams must prioritize safety. They cannot search indefinitely. Resources are finite. Terrain dictates access. When searches end without results, it leaves a void that is difficult to accept. Families are left with uncertainty rather than answers. Closure remains elusive. Over time, stories accumulate, patterns are noticed, questions are asked. Why do some people vanish without trace while others are found quickly? Why do experienced individuals succumb to dangers they understand? Why does the land sometimes give back remains years later, and other times keep them forever? There is no single explanation. Each disappearance has its own context, its own chain of events. But the common thread is vulnerability. Walking through this environment exposes humans to forces that operate quietly and relentlessly. Fatigue, cold, confusion. These do not announce themselves with spectacle. They work in the background, eroding judgment and strength until a person can no longer compensate. The idea that someone can walk out and never walk back challenges our sense of control. It suggests that survival is not always tied to intentional skill, that preparation, while essential, is not a guarantee. This is uncomfortable to acknowledge, especially in cultures that prize mastery over environment. Yet, for those who live in Alaska, this reality is not abstract. It is woven into daily decisions. People plan carefully, they leave notes, they carry emergency gear even on short trips. They respect the land not out of fear, but out of recognition. The stories of those who did not return serve as reminders rather than legends. As we continue, moving from individual disappearances to the broader silence that follows them, the focus shifts from the moment of vanishing to what remains afterward. Because in many cases what lingers is not evidence but absence, and in a land this vast, absence can stretch on indefinitely, shaping how the Alaska Triangle is remembered and why its questions persist. There is a point in many disappearance cases when effort gives way to acceptance. Not acceptance in the sense of understanding, but acceptance of limits. Search grids have been flown, trails have been walked, dogs have tracked and then lost the scent. Weather has intervened, time has passed, and eventually the wilderness does what it often does in Alaska. It keeps its secrets. This is one of the most difficult aspects for people outside the region to fully grasp. In many places, secrets are temporary, evidence is uncovered, records surface, witnesses come forward. Even if answers take years, they tend to arrive eventually. In the Alaska Triangle, there are times when the land simply does not return what it has taken, not because it is hostile or deliberate, but because its systems operate on scales that do not align with human timelines or expectations. The wilderness here is not static. It is constantly moving, reshaping itself in subtle and not so subtle ways. Snow falls and melts, rivers flood and retreat, permafrost shifts, glaciers creep forward, grind, and then recede, carrying with them anything caught in their path. Forests grow dense, then burn, then grow again. What is visible one season may be completely hidden the next. When something disappears, these processes begin almost immediately. Footprints soften, then vanish. Scents disperse. Tracks are overwritten by animal movement or erased by weather. Objects degrade quickly in cold, wet conditions. Metal corrodes. Fabric tears. Plastic becomes brittle. Within days or weeks, evidence that might have been obvious at first becomes indistinguishable from the surrounding environment. This is not a failure of investigation, it is a reality of terrain and climate. Even when search teams arrive quickly, they are racing against forces that do not pause or slow down. In some cases, the environment alters the scene faster than humans can document it. There is also the matter of where disappearances occur. Many happen far from established routes, off trails, beyond the edges of commonly travelled areas. These locations are not revisited often. A search may cover them once, maybe twice, but years can pass before anyone returns to that exact spot. If remains or wreckage are present, they may lie undisturbed, unseen, until chance brings someone back. Chance plays a larger role than people like to admit. Some discoveries happen because a hiker takes a different path. A pilot notices something unusual while flying an unrelated route. A glacier melts back just enough to reveal debris. These moments are unpredictable. They cannot be scheduled or guaranteed. For every discovery made this way, there may be many more that never occur. The wilderness also has a way of redistributing what it absorbs. Rivers carry objects downstream. Animals move bones. Ice fractures and shifts. What begins as a localized event can become spread out across miles of terrain. When remains are found, they are sometimes incomplete, scattered, or displaced from the original site. This complicates identification and reconstruction. For families, this uncertainty is often harder than a confirmed outcome. Without physical evidence, grief has no anchor. There is nothing to bury, no definitive explanation to hold on to. The mind fills in gaps, cycling through possibilities, revisiting last conversations, imagining alternate decisions. The wilderness, in keeping its secrets, extends the emotional impact far beyond the moment of disappearance. Investigators face their own frustrations. They work with incomplete data. They must decide when to suspend active searches, knowing that doing so feels like giving up, even when it's the only safe and practical option. They document what they can, file reports, and move on to the next call, carrying unresolved cases with them. Over time, these unresolved cases accumulate. They become part of the region's narrative. Not because they are supernatural or inexplicable in principle, but because they remain unexplained in practice. The wilderness does not offer clarifications. It does not distinguish between what was accidental, unfortunate, or avoidable. It simply continues. This tendency to keep secrets has contributed to the Alaska Triangle's reputation. Stories grow more unsettling when they lack conclusions. Human imagination dislikes open endings. It seeks patterns, causes, and meaning. When none are provided, speculation fills the space. Over years and decades, this can shift perception, making ordinary environmental challenges feel ominous or intentional. Yet, from another perspective, the wilderness is not withholding information. It is simply indifferent to the act of explanation. It does not preserve evidence for human benefit. It does not prioritize clarity. Its processes are neutral, consistent, and unconcerned with storytelling. Those who live and work in Alaska often understand this instinctively. They speak of the land with respect rather than suspicion. They know that not everything lost will be found. They plan accordingly, preparing for the possibility that mistakes may not be recoverable. This awareness shapes behavior, culture, and expectations. The idea of secrets implies intent, but what exists here is something closer to erasure. The environment does not guard information, it dissolves it. Over time, the difference matters. It reframes disappearances not as mysteries waiting to be solved, but as events that have passed beyond human reach. This does not mean answers never emerge. As mentioned before, some cases are resolved years later through unexpected discoveries. But even these resolutions are partial. They confirm what happened in broad terms without filling in every detail. The wilderness may give something back, but rarely everything. As we continue, this theme remains central. The silence that follows a disappearance is not empty. It is shaped by terrain, climate, and scale. It is a silence filled with movement and change, even when it appears still. Understanding that helps explain why so many questions remain unanswered inside the Alaska Triangle, and why, in some cases, they always will. Because when the wilderness keeps its secrets, it does so not out of malice or mystery, but simply because it does not operate on human terms. And once something passes into that system, it becomes part of a much larger story, one that does not pause to explain itself before moving on. There is a moment that comes after every disappearance, a moment that feels heavier than the search itself. It arrives when the initial urgency fades, when engines are shut down, radios go quiet, and the landscape settles back into its usual stillness. This is the strange silence that follows. Not the peaceful quiet of untouched wilderness, but a silence shaped by absence, by unanswered questions, and by the sudden realization that something is missing in a place that is already defined by emptiness. In the Alaska Triangle, this silence has a particular weight. It does not arrive gently. It presses in slowly, filling the space where movement, voices, and purpose once existed. Search teams may have spent days or weeks combing terrain, coordinating flights, checking signals, and following faint leads. Then, at some point, the effort stops. Not because the desire to find answers disappears, but because there is nothing left to act on. The silence begins there. For families, this silence can be unbearable. During the active search, there is at least structure. Updates arrive, plans are made. Hope, however fragile, still has a place to rest. Once the search is suspended, that structure collapses. Days stretch out without new information. Every sound, every phone call, every unexpected knock becomes charged with meaning. And then, more often than not, nothing happens. The land contributes to this silence in ways that are difficult to articulate. Alaska's wilderness does not echo human activity for long. Footsteps fade. Voices are absorbed. Even the signs of search efforts, flags, tracks, temporary camps, are quickly erased by weather and time. Within weeks, sometimes days, it can look as though no one was ever there. The environment resets itself, leaving behind no visible record of what occurred. This erasure can feel deeply wrong to those left behind. In more populated places, a disappearance leaves marks: police tape, news coverage, ongoing investigations. In the Alaska Triangle, the physical traces vanish almost as completely as the person did. The land offers no memorial, no boundary between before and after. It simply continues. Communities feel this silence differently depending on their size and closeness. In small towns or villages, everyone knows when someone goes missing. The absence is noticed immediately. A familiar face no longer appears. A routine is disrupted. Conversations lower in volume. People avoid certain topics, not out of indifference, but out of respect and uncertainty. There is a shared understanding that the silence is not empty, but full of things no one knows how to say. In larger hubs like Anchorage, the silence is more diffuse. Life continues, traffic moves, workdays proceed. But for those directly affected, the contrast can feel jarring. The world does not pause in acknowledgement of what has been lost. The absence becomes something private, carried quietly through crowded spaces. Investigators and search personnel experience their own version of this silence. They are trained to act, to follow procedures, to solve problems. An unresolved disappearance sits uneasily within that framework. Files remain open without progress. Questions linger without answers. There is no final report that neatly closes the case. Instead, there is a record of what was attempted, what was found, and what was not. Over time, this silence can transform the way cases are remembered. Details blur, dates are forgotten, names fade from public awareness. What remains is a general sense that something happened somewhere and was never resolved. These stories become part of the region's background noise, mentioned occasionally, referenced indirectly but rarely revisited in full. The silence also feeds imagination. Humans are not comfortable with gaps in narrative. When facts end, speculation begins. In the absence of clear explanations, people look for meaning elsewhere. Patterns are drawn, connections are suggested. The unknown takes on a shape that may not reflect reality, but fills the void left by uncertainty. This is where the Alaska Triangle's reputation deepens. The silence after disappearances is not just an absence of sound or information. It is an absence of resolution. Each unresolved case adds to a cumulative sense that something about this place resists understanding. Not because it is actively concealing answers, but because it does not prioritize providing them. The environment reinforces this feeling through its scale. Standing in a vast, empty landscape, it becomes easy to feel small and disconnected. The idea that someone could vanish here and leave no trace begins to feel less abstract. The silence becomes a physical presence shaped by wind, distance, and the lack of human markers. Even time behaves differently in this silence. Days pass slowly at first, heavy with waiting. Then weeks blur together. Seasons change. Snow falls, melts, and falls again. The absence becomes normalized, not because it hurts less, but because it has no clear endpoint. There is no moment when it resolves itself. For some families, this silence becomes a permanent companion. They live with unanswered questions indefinitely. Birthdays pass, anniversaries come and go. Life continues, but with an unspoken gap woven into it. The wilderness, by remaining silent, extends its influence far beyond the physical disappearance. It is important to understand that this silence is not intentional. It is not a message or a warning. It is simply the result of systems that do not align with human needs for closure. The land does not remember events in ways humans can access. It does not preserve evidence for emotional reasons. Its silence is not a response. It is a condition. And yet, that condition shapes everything that follows a disappearance. It shapes how stories are told, how warnings are issued, how people prepare or fail to prepare for their own journeys. It shapes how the Alaska Triangle is spoken about, often in hushed tones, as if louder voices might disturb something fragile or unresolved. As we move forward, this silence becomes a backdrop for understanding other factors at play. Navigation failures, environmental hazards, human error and cultural context all exist within this quiet space. None of them operate in isolation. They're layered over the silence, shaped by it, and sometimes hidden within it. The strange silence after a disappearance is not just an ending, it is a state that persists. It stretches on, uninterrupted, absorbing stories, questions and memories. And in a land too vast to watch closely, that silence becomes one of the most defining features of what still goes missing inside the Alaska Triangle. Direction feels like a simple concept until it isn't. In most places, knowing where you are and where you're going is supported by a web of cues so familiar they fade into the background. Roads curve predictably, landmarks stay put, compasses behave, screens update. In the Alaska Triangle, that quiet agreement between tools, terrain and human expectation begins to loosen. Not dramatically, not all at once, but just enough to introduce doubt. And once doubt enters navigation, it has a way of spreading. Alaska sits in a part of the world where Earth's magnetic field behaves differently than it does farther south. The magnetic North Pole does not align neatly with true north, and the difference between them, known as magnetic declination, is larger and more variable here. That alone is not unusual in a scientific sense. What makes it consequential is how much navigation in remote Alaska still depends on compasses, both physical and digital, often as backups when other systems fail. In regions closer to the equator, a compass is a reliable reference. It points consistently. Deviations are small and well accounted for. In much of Alaska, especially within the Triangle, declination can change significantly over relatively short distances. If that variation is not understood or properly adjusted for, a compass can point a traveller in a direction that feels correct but is quietly wrong. This becomes dangerous when compounded by terrain that offers few correcting signals. In a grid of roads or a landscape filled with human markers, an error becomes obvious quickly. In dense forest, open tundra or snow-covered ground, that error can persist unnoticed for hours. A person may walk steadily, confidently, believing they are maintaining a straight line when in fact they are drifting gradually off course. Even experienced outdoorsmen are vulnerable to this. Familiarity breeds trust. A compass that has always worked before is assumed to be working now. When it isn't, the mind looks elsewhere for explanations. Fatigue, weather, distraction. Rarely does someone immediately suspect that their fundamental sense of direction has been compromised. Magnetic interference does not always announce itself clearly. It can be subtle. A compass needle that hesitates. A reading that feels slightly off but not enough to trigger alarm. Digital compasses, like those in phones or GPS units, can also be affected. These devices rely on magnetometers that are sensitive to both external magnetic fields and internal interference from the device itself. Cold temperatures can further degrade performance, affecting battery life and sensor accuracy. GPS, often assumed to be infallible, has its own vulnerabilities. Satellite signals can be blocked by terrain, especially in mountainous areas. Dense forest canopy can weaken reception. Solar activity can introduce errors. When GPS loses signal, it may freeze, display outdated information, or attempt to extrapolate position based on incomplete data. A traveller relying heavily on that information may not realise it is no longer accurate. The psychological impact of lost direction is as significant as the technical one. Humans rely on orientation not just to move, but to feel safe. Knowing where you are provides a sense of control. When that certainty erodes, stress increases. Stress narrows attention. Decision-making becomes reactive rather than deliberate. Small navigation errors compound as the mind shifts from planning to coping. In the Alaska Triangle, this psychological shift can happen quickly. The environment offers little reassurance. The landscape often looks the same in every direction. Trees do not thin gradually. Hills rise and fall without clear patterns. Snow erases distinguishing features. Without external confirmation, people rely more heavily on internal judgment, which is precisely what becomes unreliable under stress. There are documented cases where individuals travelled in nearly perfect circles, convinced they were moving in a straight line. This phenomenon, sometimes called circular walking, occurs when the brain's internal sense of direction is subtly skewed. In open terrain without landmarks, people tend to drift toward their dominant side. Over time, this creates a loop. In Alaska's wilderness, such loops can extend for miles. Magnetic confusion also affects aviation, particularly in smaller aircraft flying at lower altitudes. Pilots are trained to account for magnetic declination, but rapidly changing conditions can complicate this. When visibility is poorer and reliance on instruments increases, even small discrepancies matter. A heading that is slightly off can place an aircraft closer to terrain than expected, or divert it into unfamiliar airspace. Historically, before modern navigation systems were widespread, pilots in Alaska relied heavily on dead reckoning, estimating position based on speed, time, and direction. This method is vulnerable to cumulative error, especially when winds differ from forecasts. Magnetic variation adds another layer of uncertainty. Over long distances, small errors become large ones. On the ground, magnetic anomalies have been reported anecdotally for decades. Compasses spinning, readings that fluctuate without apparent cause. While many of these reports likely involve equipment issues or misunderstanding, the consistency of such stories has contributed to the perception that something about this region interferes with direction itself. Scientifically, Earth's magnetic field is not uniform. It contains irregularities caused by variations in the planet's core and crust. Alaska's geology is complex, shaped by tectonic activity, volcanic history, and mineral deposits. These factors can create localized magnetic disturbances. In most cases, the effect is minor. In combination with other stresses, it can become meaningful. What makes this particularly relevant to disappearances is how easily lost direction can escalate into a survival situation. A person who believes they are heading towards safety may in fact be moving deeper into isolation. By the time they realize the mistake, energy reserves may be depleted, weather may have changed, turning back may no longer be an option. There is also a tendency for people to discount their own disorientation. Admitting you are lost feels like failure. Many individuals delay corrective action, hoping clarity will return on its own. In Alaska, delay is costly. Conditions do not pause to allow reassessment. The land continues to operate on its own terms. Rescue teams often encounter evidence of this process after the fact. Tracks that veer inexplicably. Camps set up in locations that do not align with the stated destination. Equipment abandoned at points that suggest confusion rather than strategy. These signs are interpreted carefully, not as judgments, but as clues to the mental state of the missing person. It is important to note that magnetic confusion alone does not cause disappearances. It is a contributing factor, one that interacts with environment, fatigue, weather, and human psychology. On its own, it is manageable. Combined with other pressures, it becomes dangerous. Modern training emphasizes redundancy for this reason. Multiple navigation methods, regular position checks, clear turnaround points, conservative decision-making. These practices reduce risk, but they do not eliminate it. Not everyone follows them perfectly. Not every situation allows for ideal choices. The Alaska Triangle is not unique in having magnetic variation, but it is distinctive in how little room it offers for correction once navigation goes wrong. In flatter, more populated regions, drifting off course often leads to something recognizable eventually. A road, a fence, a building. Here, drifting off course often leads to more of the same landscape, extending in all directions. This contributes to the eerie feeling reported by some who have become disoriented in the region. A sense that direction has lost meaning, that moving does not produce progress, that the environment is indifferent to effort. These feelings are not supernatural. They are psychological responses to a system that has stopped providing feedback. When stories of magnetic confusion circulate, they are sometimes framed as evidence of something strange or unexplained. In reality, they highlight how dependent humans are on consistent reference systems, and how vulnerable we become when those systems falter. The Earth's magnetic field is not designed for human convenience. It exists independently of our needs. Understanding this helps reframe many disappearance cases. Instead of asking what pulled someone away from safety, it becomes more useful to ask how their sense of direction quietly eroded, how small discrepancies went unnoticed, how confidence persisted just long enough to prevent timely correction. As we move forward, examining other environmental and human factors, magnetic confusion remains an important piece of the puzzle, not as a mystery force, but as a reminder that orientation is not guaranteed. In a place as vast and uncompromising as the Alaska Triangle, losing direction is not a dramatic event. It is often a quiet one, unfolding step by step, until the distance back becomes too great to cross. Weather in Alaska does not behave like weather elsewhere. It does not follow a predictable script, and it does not wait for human readiness. Within the Alaska Triangle, weather feels less like a background condition and more like an active participant, changing plans, reshaping terrain, and quietly deciding outcomes. People who spend time here often describe it as if it has intention, not because it truly does, but because its timing and impact feel unnervingly precise. Forecasts exist, of course, but they are only approximations. Large-scale models struggle to account for the local effects created by Alaska's geography. Mountains interrupt airflow, valleys trap cold, water bodies generate fog, air masses collide and separate with little warning. A forecast that looks reasonable in Anchorage may be meaningless 100 miles away, and within the triangle, 100 miles is a very short distance. One of the most dangerous aspects of Alaskan weather is how quickly it changes. Clear skies can collapse into whiteout conditions in minutes. Visibility can drop from miles to a few feet with almost no transition. This is especially true in mountainous areas, where clouds can form rapidly as moist air is forced upward. A pilot or hiker may commit to a route based on what they can see, only to find that view erased shortly afterward. Fog is a frequent culprit. It rolls in quietly, thickening until depth perception disappears. Landmarks blur, the horizon dissolves. For pilots flying visually, fog is disorienting and unforgiving. For people on foot, it turns even familiar terrain into an abstract space, where distance and direction are difficult to judge. Moving through fog increases the risk of missteps, falls and navigation errors, all while masking the urgency of the situation. Snow introduces its own set of problems. Fresh snowfall can hide hazards like crevasses, uneven ground and thin ice. It erases tracks, making backtracking nearly impossible. In wind, snow can drift rapidly, reshaping the landscape in ways that make recent memories unreliable. A route taken an hour earlier may no longer be visible or safe. Cold magnifies every other risk. Equipment behaves differently in low temperatures. Batteries drain faster, plastics crack, metal becomes brittle. Even simple tasks like fastening straps or operating zippers become more difficult with numb fingers. Cold also affects the body in subtle ways. Reaction times slow, judgment becomes impaired. Shivering consumes energy that might be needed later. Wind is another factor that is often underestimated. In Alaska, wind is not just an annoyance. It can destabilize aircraft, push hikers off balance, and accelerate heat loss dramatically. Gusts can arrive without warning, especially near mountain passes or along coastlines. For pilots, wind shear can make takeoffs and landings hazardous. For people on foot, sustained wind can turn a manageable temperature into a survival situation. Storms in the region are rarely neat or symmetrical. They break apart, reform, and shift direction unpredictably. A storm cell may linger over one area while leaving another untouched. This patchwork behaviour complicates decision-making. Someone may believe they can outrun a storm or wait it out, only to find that it has settled in place. Another challenge is duration. Alaskan weather does not always pass quickly. Systems can stall, holding conditions in place for days. This is particularly dangerous for those waiting for rescue or planning to move once conditions improve. Waiting consumes supplies and energy. Moving too soon introduces risk. Deciding when to act becomes a gamble. Seasonal transitions are especially volatile. Spring and fall bring rapid freeze-thaw cycles. Ice weakens unexpectedly. Rivers swell with meltwater. Snow bridges collapse. These changes are not always visible from a distance. A crossing that looks solid can fail underfoot, plunging someone into freezing water where survival time is measured in minutes. Winter adds the complication of darkness. In northern regions, daylight hours shrink dramatically. Travel that might be manageable in daylight becomes far more dangerous at night. Artificial light offers limited range and depth perception. Shadows distort terrain. Fatigue sets in faster when the body's internal clock is disrupted by prolonged darkness. Summer presents a different but equally deceptive challenge. Extended daylight can encourage longer travel than is safe. People push on, assuming visibility equals safety. Fatigue accumulates unnoticed. Sleep becomes irregular. Decision-making suffers. When weather shifts late in the day, there may be no easy place to stop and recover. For search and rescue operations, weather dictates everything. Aircraft may be grounded for days. Ground teams may be unable to reach certain areas safely. Even when conditions are marginally acceptable, the risk to rescuers must be weighed against the likelihood of success. This is a painful calculation, especially when lives may be at stake. Many disappearance cases include references to weather that was described as manageable, improving, or not expected to be severe. These descriptions are accurate from a narrow perspective. What they fail to capture is how quickly manageable can become unforgiving in this environment. Alaska does not require extreme weather to be dangerous. Moderate conditions are often enough. The idea that weather thinks for itself comes from this sense of independence. It does not respond to preparation in the way people expect. Being well equipped reduces risk, but it does not grant immunity. Plans that make sense in one moment can become irrelevant in the next. Flexibility is essential, but flexibility has limits when options disappear. Over time, people who work and live in Alaska develop a cautious respect for this behaviour. They learn to read subtle signs, changes in cloud texture, shifts in wind direction, drops in pressure. Even so, surprises happen. Experience improves odds, not certainty. In disappearance investigations, weather often becomes both explanation and obstacle. It provides plausible reasons for accidents, exposure, and disorientation. At the same time, it destroys evidence, delays searches, and complicates reconstruction. By the time conditions allow investigation, the scene has often changed beyond recognition. This dual role contributes to the lingering uncertainty around many cases. Weather explains enough to be believable, but not enough to be satisfying. It fills in some gaps while widening others. It answers the question of how things could have gone wrong, without revealing exactly how they did. As we move further into the patterns that define the Alaska Triangle, weather remains a constant presence. Not dramatic in every instance, not always extreme, but consistently influential. It shapes decisions, limits options, and alters outcomes quietly and decisively. In a place this vast, weather does not need to be violent to be final. It only needs to change at the wrong moment, in the wrong place, when someone is already stretched thin. and when that happens, the land absorbs the result, leaving behind little more than silence and a forecast that no longer matters. Cold does not announce itself as an enemy. It arrives quietly, settling into clothing, skin and breath without drama. In the Alaska Triangle, cold is not an occasional hardship. It is a constant presence that shapes every decision, every movement, and every outcome. Darkness often arrives alongside it, not as a simple absence of light, but as a condition that alters perception, judgment, and the body's ability to cope. Together, cold and darkness expose the limits of the human body in ways that are easy to underestimate and difficult to recover from. The human body is remarkably adaptable, but it has boundaries that cannot be negotiated. In cold environments, survival depends on maintaining core temperature. The moment heat loss exceeds heat production, the clock starts running. What makes cold so dangerous is not just how low the temperature drops, but how efficiently it strips warmth away. Wind accelerates this process. Moisture magnifies it. Stillness makes it worse. In Alaska, these factors often combine. Hypothermia does not begin with collapse. It begins with subtle changes that are easy to miss. Fingers lose dexterity. Simple tasks take longer. Speech slows slightly. Decision-making becomes less precise. The body redirects blood flow toward vital organs, leaving extremities colder and less responsive. These changes feel manageable at first. People adapt without realizing they are already compromised. As core temperature continues to drop, the effects become more pronounced. Shivering intensifies, consuming energy rapidly. Muscles weaken. Coordination suffers. Judgment deteriorates further. This is where dangerous decisions are often made, not out of recklessness, but because the brain itself is losing its ability to evaluate risk accurately. Turning back may feel unnecessary. Pressing on may feel logical. The body, meanwhile, is quietly losing the capacity to support either choice. Darkness compounds these effects. In much of Alaska, darkness is not limited to nighttime. During winter months, it can stretch across most or all of the day. Even in other seasons, cloud cover, dense forest and terrain can create deep shadow where light barely penetrates. Darkness removes visual information the brain relies on to orient itself. Depth perception falters. Hazards become harder to detect. Movement slows as uncertainty increases. The psychological impact of darkness should not be underestimated. Humans evolved to rely heavily on vision. When that sense is restricted, stress levels rise, anxiety increases. The mind fills in gaps with assumptions that are often incorrect. Fatigue sets in faster when the body's internal clock is disrupted, especially during extended periods without natural light cues. Sleep becomes irregular in these conditions. Without clear day-night cycles, the body struggles to regulate rest. People may push themselves longer than they should, believing they are still alert when they are not. Exhaustion accumulates quietly. Reaction times slow. Mistakes become more likely, and in cold environments, mistakes are costly. Cold also affects hydration and nutrition in ways that are easy to overlook. Thirst is blunted in low temperatures. People drink less than they need, leading to dehydration that worsens fatigue and cognitive impairment. Calories are burned rapidly to generate heat. Without adequate intake, energy reserves drop quickly. Hunger may be ignored in favour of movement, but the body cannot sustain that imbalance for long. In disappearance cases, these physiological limits often explain behaviours that seem confusing from the outside. Abandoned gear, unfinished shelters, routes that do not align with logic. These are sometimes interpreted as signs of panic or irrationality. More often, they reflect a body and mind operating under extreme stress, making decisions with impaired tools. One particularly tragic phenomenon associated with hypothermia is paradoxical undressing. As core temperature drops to critical levels, blood vessels may suddenly dilate, creating a sensation of warmth. Individuals may remove clothing, believing they are overheating. This behavior is not a conscious choice. It is a neurological failure triggered by severe cold. In Alaska, where temperatures can remain dangerously low for extended periods, this phenomenon has been documented in both urban and wilderness settings. Darkness also interferes with rescue efforts. Locating someone in low light is exponentially more difficult. Visual searches lose effectiveness. Thermal imaging can help, but dense cover and uneven terrain limit its reach. Time becomes an enemy. The longer someone remains exposed, the narrower the window for survival becomes. Even those who survive initial exposure may face long-term consequences. Frostbite damages tissue permanently. Nerve injury can impair sensation and movement. Cognitive effects from prolonged hypothermia may linger. Survival is not always a return to normalcy. It often carries lasting cost. The limits of the human body are not moral failures, they are biological realities. In the Alaska Triangle, these realities are tested frequently. People do not disappear because they are weak. They disappear because the environment pushes human physiology beyond its design parameters. It's also important to recognize that modern clothing and equipment, while vastly improved, do not eliminate these risks. Insulation helps, but only if it stays dry. Layers trap heat, but only if the body has energy to generate it. Technology extends reach, but it cannot override biology. Batteries fail in cold, screens freeze, devices become unreliable precisely when they are needed most. Darkness and cold together create a feedback loop. Cold increases fatigue. Fatigue impairs judgment. Impaired judgment leads to exposure. Exposure deepens cold. Darkness accelerates this cycle by removing cues that might prompt rest, shelter, or retreat. Once the loop begins, breaking it requires resources, awareness, and often assistance that may not be available. This is why so many disappearance cases include references to conditions that were described as tolerable. The temperature was cold but not extreme. The darkness was expected. The distance was manageable. These assessments are not wrong in isolation. They become wrong when combined and extended over time. People who live in Alaska understand this implicitly. They plan conservatively. They turn back early. They carry emergency gear even on short trips. They respect darkness as much as cold. Even so, accidents happen. Experience reduces risk, but it does not remove it. For those unfamiliar with the region, these limits are easier to misjudge. Confidence from other environments does not always transfer. Skills learned elsewhere may not account for the speed at which conditions change or the cumulative effect of cold and darkness on the body. In the context of the Alaska Triangle, these factors provide a grounded explanation for many vanishings. They do not explain every detail. They do not account for every unanswered question. But they explain how quickly a situation can cross the threshold from difficult to irreversible. Cold and darkness do not need to be extreme to be final. They only need time, and in a land where time stretches differently, where help is distant, and where observation is sparse, that time is often available. As we continue, shifting attention toward those who have come close to disappearing but returned with stories of near misses, these limits remain central. Survival here is not about bravery or strength alone. It is about recognizing when the body is approaching its edge and understanding that beyond that edge, the land does not negotiate. Pilots who fly in Alaska tend to speak differently about risk than pilots elsewhere, not because they are more reckless, but because they have learned, often the hard way, that survival here is rarely about avoiding danger entirely. It is about recognizing when danger is quietly approaching, sometimes disguised as normal conditions. The stories that come from those who almost didn't return are not heroic tales filled with dramatic last-second rescues. They are restrained, careful accounts of moments when the margin became thin enough that it could be felt physically. Many of these pilots describe a specific instant when something shifted. Not an explosion or a failure, but a realization. A heading that no longer matched expectations. a cloud layer that thickened too quickly, a valley that narrowed more than anticipated. These moments often arrive without urgency at first. There is time to think, but not much time. And in that narrow window, decisions carry weight that is difficult to explain to anyone who hasn't experienced it. One common thread in these stories is how normal the beginning felt. A routine supply run, a short passenger flight, a familiar route flown dozens of times before, the aircraft checked out. The weather briefing seemed reasonable. Nothing about the departure suggested that the return would be uncertain. This normalcy is what makes the memory linger. If something obvious had gone wrong, it would be easier to accept. Instead, the situation develops gradually, through a series of small changes that only later reveal how close the outcome came to being permanent. Pilots talk often about weather closing in behind them. The forward view still looks flyable, but turning back reveals a wall of cloud that wasn't there minutes earlier. In Alaska's terrain, options disappear quickly. Valleys funnel aircraft forward. Mountain passes narrow. Climbing may not be possible due to cloud ceilings or icing. Descending may put the aircraft too close to terrain. The sense of being guided by the landscape rather than guiding oneself is unsettling. Several pilots recount moments of complete spatial disorientation. Flying into a cloud layer unexpectedly, the horizon vanishes. Instruments become the only reference, but stress interferes with interpretation. The body insists one thing, while the instruments indicate another. Trusting the instruments goes against instinct, yet instinct cannot be trusted in that moment. Those who survive often say that forcing themselves to ignore their senses was one of the hardest things they have ever done. There are stories of engines sputtering in cold air, not failing outright, but losing enough power to change the equation. Carburetor icing, fuel flow issues, minor mechanical problems that would be manageable over flat land become critical over mountains and forests. In these moments, pilots calculate glide distances, look for possible landing sites that may not exist, and weigh choices that all carry risk. Emergency landings in Alaska are rarely clean. There are few open fields. Rivers may be frozen, partially frozen, or flowing too fast. Beaches shift with tides and storms. Snow-covered terrain can hide obstacles that tear apart landing gear. Pilots who have landed successfully in these conditions describe the experience as controlled damage rather than safe landing. The goal becomes survival, not preservation of the aircraft. Some stories involve near misses that never escalated into emergencies, yet still left lasting impressions. A sudden downdraft that pushed the plane toward terrain. Wind shear on approach that nearly overwhelmed control authority. A navigation error that placed the aircraft over unfamiliar ground, with fuel reserves lower than planned. These moments pass quickly, but they alter perception permanently. What stands out in these accounts is how rarely pilots frame their experiences as encounters with mystery. They do not describe unseen forces or inexplicable phenomena. They describe complexity, variables stacking faster than they can be processed, situations where training provides guidance but not certainty. They speak of respect rather than fear, of lessons learned rather than warnings ignored. Many pilots mention the psychological aftermath. Returning safely does not end the experience. The mind replays the event, analysing decisions, wondering how close the line truly was. Confidence is shaken, then rebuilt more carefully. Some pilots change their flying habits, others take breaks. A few stop flying in certain areas altogether. Survival leaves a mark. These stories also highlight the role of humility. Pilots who have come close to disaster often emphasise how little control they truly had. Skill mattered, but luck mattered too. Timing mattered. A slight shift in wind, a brief opening in clouds, an engine that held together just long enough. They resist narratives that paint them as exceptional. Instead, they stress how easily the outcome could have been different. In discussions of the Alaska Triangle, these near-miss accounts are crucial. They show how disappearances can occur without extraordinary causes. They demonstrate how quickly conditions can overwhelm even experienced individuals. When a pilot who returns describes how close they came to vanishing, it reframes stories of those who did not. There is also a recurring theme of decision fatigue. Long flights require constant monitoring, weather updates, fuel calculations, terrain awareness. Over time, mental resources are depleted. The ability to adapt slows. Pilots describe moments when they realize they have been operating on momentum rather than intention. Catching that realization in time often made the difference. Technology plays a complex role in these stories. Modern avionics, GPS, and weather data improve safety dramatically. Yet pilots caution against over-reliance. Screens can fail. Data can lag behind reality. In rapidly changing conditions, technology may provide a false sense of security. Several pilots recount situations where trusting what they could see and feel, rather than what the display suggested, prevented worse outcomes. Conversely, there are cases where trusting instruments over perception saved lives. This tension underscores the difficulty of flying in environments where neither human senses nor technology can be fully trusted. Judgment becomes the critical factor, but judgment itself is vulnerable to stress, fatigue, and incomplete information. Pilots also speak about silence, the quiet moments after an incident, when the engine hums steadily again and the landscape opens up. Relief arrives slowly. The realization of what almost happened settles in later, often on the ground, long after the danger has passed. That delayed processing is part of why these stories are shared carefully, without exaggeration. In some accounts, pilots mention flying past areas where other aircraft are believed to have disappeared. Knowing that someone else did not make it through the same environment changes perspective. It adds weight to decisions not as fear but as awareness. The sky feels less empty and more layered with unseen histories. These stories rarely end with advice framed as rules. Instead, they emphasize mindset, conservative planning, willingness to turn back early, respect for weather even when forecasts look acceptable, acknowledgement that no flight is routine in this environment, no matter how familiar the route. What emerges from these accounts is a picture of aviation in Alaska as an ongoing negotiation rather than a controlled process. Pilots operate within constraints that shift constantly. Success depends on recognizing when negotiation is no longer possible and acting before options vanish. This perspective helps explain why some flights disappear without explanation. If experienced pilots can come within moments of disaster and return only through a combination of skill and chance, it becomes easier to understand how others might cross that threshold without recovery. The difference between returning and vanishing is often measured in minutes, sometimes seconds. As we move forward, transitioning from those who survived near misses to the searchers that followed those who did not return, these stories serve as context. They do not solve the mystery of every disappearance, but they illuminate the environment in which those disappearances occur. They show how fragile control can be, and how quickly the sky can shift from pathway to barrier. The pilots who almost didn't return carry their experiences quietly. They do not seek attention. They share their stories not to dramatize danger but to acknowledge it honestly. And in doing so, they offer a grounded understanding of how the Alaska Triangle continues to claim aircraft, not through spectacle or anomaly, but through complexity, scale, and the narrow limits of human response when conditions align against them. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from searching without finding. It is not the physical fatigue of hiking rough terrain or flying long hours over empty ground, though that is certainly part of it. It is a deeper weariness, one that settles in when effort produces no answers, when every method is applied correctly and still leads nowhere. In the Alaska Triangle, search parties encounter this outcome often enough that it has become an expected, if deeply unwelcome, possibility. Search operations usually begin with urgency and structure. A last known location is established, however imprecise. Timelines are reconstructed, weather conditions are reviewed, flight paths are estimated. On the ground, teams divide terrain into grids. In the air, pilots fly overlapping patterns designed to catch even small irregularities. Dogs are brought in. Volunteers assemble. For a time, the land is filled with movement, noise, and purpose. Then gradually, that momentum slows. One reason searches fail here is scale. Even a focused search area can cover hundreds of square miles. Mountains, forests, wetlands, and rivers break that space into countless hiding places. From above, a person on the ground is nearly invisible unless they are moving or signalling. Clothing blends into natural colours. A body lying still does not draw attention the way people imagine it might. On the ground, visibility is often worse. Dense brush limits sightlines to a few yards. Uneven terrain hides depressions, crevices, and slopes. Snow smooths everything into sameness. Searchers can pass within feet of something important without seeing it. This is not hypothetical. It has happened repeatedly, confirmed later, when remains or wreckage were discovered in areas that had already been searched. Weather undermines even the best planned efforts. Fog grounds, aircraft. Wind scatters scent trails. Rain washes away footprints. Snowfall resets the landscape entirely. A delay of even a few hours can dramatically reduce the effectiveness of tracking. By the time teams arrive, the environment may no longer resemble the conditions that existed when the person disappeared. Time works against searches in another way as well. Survival windows close quickly in cold environments. As hours turn into days, the focus shifts from rescue to recovery, even if that shift is not spoken aloud. This change alters priorities, resources, and decision-making. When the likelihood of finding someone alive drops, the justification for taking risks diminishes. Search leaders must constantly balance urgency with safety. Sending teams into hazardous conditions can create additional emergencies. Aircraft accidents during search operations are a known risk. Ground teams face exposure, injury, and disorientation themselves. There are cases where searches have been called off, not because hope was gone, but because continuing would likely result in more people needing rescue. As searches expand without results, confidence erodes. Each empty grid, each uneventful flight, reinforces the possibility that nothing will be found. This does not mean teams stop caring. It means they must confront the reality that the environment may already have erased the evidence they are looking for. There is also the problem of false positives and dead ends. Reports come in from the public. A flash of colour seen from a plane, an unusual shape spotted on a hillside, a signal detected briefly and then lost. Each lead must be investigated. Each consumes time and energy. Most lead nowhere. The emotional toll of repeatedly approaching hope and then watching it dissolve is significant. Search dogs, often viewed as near-magical tools, have limits too. Scent disperses unpredictably in cold, windy conditions. Snow and water break trails. Time weakens signals. Dogs may track confidently for a distance and then stop abruptly, not because the person vanished in an extraordinary way, but because the scent environment changed beyond recognition. In some cases, searches uncover items that raise more questions than answers. A boot, a piece of clothing, equipment found far from where it was expected to be. These discoveries can suggest movement, confusion, or attempts at self-rescue. They can also mislead, pulling attention away from more likely locations. Interpreting such finds is difficult, especially without a clear narrative. The emotional impact on searchers themselves is often overlooked. Many are volunteers or local responders who live in the same communities as the missing. They may know the person they are searching for or know their family. Walking for days through difficult terrain with that knowledge weighs heavily. When the search ends without results, there is a sense of unfinished business that lingers. For families, the conclusion of a search is rarely experienced as closure. It feels more like abandonment, even when they understand the practical reasons. The phrase "nothing was found" carries a finality that does not align with hope. It suggests an end without explanation, a stopping point without resolution. In the Alaska Triangle, this outcome is repeated often enough to shape expectations. People who live there understand that a search can be thorough and still fail. This does not diminish trust in the effort. It reflects an understanding of the land's scale and complexity. Outsiders sometimes interpret these failures as incompetence or mystery. Those familiar with the region see them as an unfortunate but realistic result. Over time, records accumulate. Files filled with maps, reports, and logs that end without conclusions. These documents represent immense effort compressed into administrative form. They are evidence not of absence of action, but of the limits of action. Occasionally, years later, something surfaces. A plane emerges from melting ice. Remains are found during unrelated activity. When this happens, it often reveals how close searchers came without knowing it. The discovery brings relief, but also frustration. The answers arrive too late to matter in the way they were once needed. Most searches, however, never reach that point. They remain open-ended indefinitely. The land does not return what it has taken. The silence after the search becomes permanent. This pattern reinforces the unsettling reputation of the Alaska Triangle. Not because searchers fail, but because the environment allows failure to persist without correction. In many places, unanswered questions are eventually resolved by density of observation. Here, observation is sparse, and time does not guarantee clarity. As we move forward, looking at cultural knowledge, warnings, and older understandings of this landscape, the reality of these empty searches provides important context. They show that disappearance here is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is simply complete. No evidence, no recovery, just the knowledge that everything possible was done and that it still was not enough. In a land too vast to watch closely, search parties that find nothing at all are not anomalies. They are an expected outcome of scale, weather, and time working together. And that expectation, quiet and heavy, shapes how every disappearance inside the Alaska Triangle is remembered. Long before maps drew straight lines across Alaska, long before aircraft crossed its skies or radios carried voices through the cold air, people were already moving through this land with care, intention, and restraint. They travelled on foot, by water, and later by dog team, following routes shaped not by convenience but by survival. These paths were not random. They were learned slowly, adjusted over generations, and remembered through stories rather than coordinates. Within them were warnings, not dramatic or mystical, but practical and precise. And many of those warnings still echo inside what is now called the Alaska Triangle. Indigenous peoples of Alaska have lived in this environment for thousands of years. Their survival depended on an intimate understanding of the land's behaviour. They knew where travel was possible, where it was dangerous, and where it should not be attempted at all. These judgments were not fixed. Paths shifted with seasons. Certain areas were accessible only at specific times of year. Others were avoided entirely, not out of superstition, but because experience had shown that they carried unacceptable risk. What stands out when listening to traditional knowledge is how rarely the land is framed as hostile. Instead, it is described as powerful, demanding respect and attentiveness. Danger is not personified, it is contextual. A river is safe when frozen properly and lethal when it begins to break. A mountain pass is usable in clear weather and deadly when clouds descend. A forest provides shelter and resources, but only if entered with awareness. These older warnings often take the form of stories, passed down orally. To outside ears, some of these stories sound symbolic or exaggerated. But when examined closely, they frequently encode practical guidance. A tale about a place where people vanish may correspond to an area with unstable ice, confusing terrain, or unpredictable weather. A story about spirits or unseen forces may function as a deterrent, discouraging travel through a region where rescue would be unlikely. Paths themselves were a form of knowledge. They followed ridge lines instead of valleys prone to flooding. They crossed rivers at points known to freeze reliably. They avoided areas where fog lingered or where navigation became difficult. Deviating from these paths was not forbidden, but it was understood to increase risk significantly. Knowing when not to go was as important as knowing where to go. With the arrival of modern transportation and mapping, some of this contextual knowledge was sidelined. Roads, airstrips, and flight paths created new ways of moving through the land that did not always align with older routes. Technology offered speed and reach, but it also introduced a sense of separation from the environment. Decisions could be made based on data rather than direct observation. That shift brought benefits, but it also reduced sensitivity to subtle warnings. Many disappearance cases inside the Alaska Triangle involve people travelling outside established routes, whether on foot or by air. This is not inherently reckless. Exploration and work often require it. But when these movements ignore environmental cues that older paths were designed to respect, the margin for error shrinks quickly. There are also warnings embedded in seasonal behaviour. Indigenous knowledge emphasises timing. Certain journeys are undertaken only when conditions align. Others are postponed or abandoned without hesitation if signs are unfavourable. Modern schedules, by contrast, often operate independently of local conditions. Flights run on timetables. Work deadlines apply regardless of weather. This mismatch can force decisions that traditional systems would avoid. Another aspect of older warnings involves restraint. Travel was undertaken with purpose. Wandering was discouraged not morally but practically. Energy was conserved. Risks were calculated carefully. Group travel was common, providing redundancy and support. Solo travel occurred, but it was undertaken with awareness of its dangers. Many modern disappearances involve individuals travelling alone, sometimes for convenience, sometimes out of necessity. The land itself carries memory in subtle ways. Certain areas are known to be disorienting, valleys where sound behaves strangely, plains where landmarks are scarce, regions where weather changes abruptly. These characteristics were observed and remembered long before scientific explanations were available. Avoidance was often the chosen response. When modern accounts describe places where people feel watched or feel uneasy, it is tempting to dismiss these sensations as imagination. Yet they may reflect subconscious recognition of environmental cues, changes in acoustics, shifts in wind, alterations in light. The body notices these things even when the mind cannot articulate them. Older warnings often advise paying attention to such feelings, not because they were mystical, but because they signalled misalignment with the environment. It is important to approach this knowledge respectfully, not as folklore to be mined for mystery, but as accumulated experience shaped by survival. Indigenous communities do not frame disappearances as anomalies. They are understood as outcomes of imbalance, misjudgment, or disregard for conditions. The land does not single people out. It responds consistently to actions taken within it. This perspective contrasts sharply with some modern narratives surrounding the Alaska Triangle. Where popular culture looks for hidden forces or inexplicable phenomena, older warnings point toward restraint, timing, and humility. They suggest that the land is predictable in its unpredictability if one knows how to read it. That knowledge, however, is not easily transferred. It requires time, observation, and lived experience. It cannot be fully captured in maps or manuals. As fewer people grow up immersed in this environment, that experiential understanding becomes harder to access. Modern travellers may rely on technology and generalised wilderness skills that do not account for local nuance. This gap between older warnings and modern practice helps explain why certain disappearances feel so perplexing. People enter areas that were historically avoided or approached cautiously without understanding why those practices existed. When something goes wrong, the absence of context makes the outcome feel mysterious rather than consequential. There are efforts to bridge this gap. Some search and rescue operations consult local knowledge when planning searches. Elders may advise where to look or where not to waste time. These insights are not always formalised, but they reflect a different way of understanding the land, one that prioritises pattern recognition over exhaustive coverage. When remains or wreckage are eventually found, they are sometimes located in places that align with older warnings, areas where travel was known to be risky, routes that were discouraged. This does not mean that modern victims ignored wisdom intentionally. Often, they simply did not know it existed. The Alaska Triangle, when viewed through this lens, becomes less a zone of mystery and more a region where multiple layers of knowledge intersect, sometimes imperfectly. Modern systems operate alongside ancient understandings, not always in harmony. When those systems diverge, the land does not compensate. As we move forward, shifting toward what science can explain and where its limits lie, these older warnings remain relevant. They remind us that not all knowledge is captured by instruments or databases. Some of it exists only in practice, in patterns noticed and remembered over generations. The paths people once followed and the places they avoided were not arbitrary. They were shaped by long observation of what the land allows and what it resists. When those lessons are forgotten or overlooked, the land does not change its behaviour. It simply responds as it always has. And inside the Alaska Triangle, where scale, weather and isolation already strain human systems, ignoring those older warnings can mean stepping into spaces where recovery is unlikely, and where the land, as it has done for centuries, keeps moving forward without explanation. When disappearances inside the Alaska Triangle are discussed, science is often placed in the role of final judge. It is expected to explain what happened, to separate coincidence from pattern, and to dissolve mystery into mechanism. In many cases, science does exactly that. It provides explanations that are grounded, testable, and consistent with what is known about environment, human physiology, and behaviour. And yet, even after applying those explanations carefully, something remains. Not something supernatural, but something unresolved. A remainder that science acknowledges but cannot fully eliminate. Science is very good at explaining how people get lost. Cognitive psychology has documented how stress, fatigue, cold, and fear impair judgment. Navigation errors increase when landmarks are scarce and attention is divided. Confirmation bias causes people to trust faulty assumptions longer than they should. These mechanisms are well understood and observable. In the Alaska Triangle, they operate under conditions that amplify their effects, but they are not fundamentally different from elsewhere. Environmental science explains much of the terrain-related risk. Mountains generate unpredictable weather, rivers reshape land, snow alters visibility and erases evidence, cold accelerates heat loss and equipment failure. None of these processes are mysterious. They are measurable and repeatable. When a disappearance occurs during a storm, near water, or in extreme cold, science offers plausible pathways for how things went wrong. Aviation science also fills in many gaps. It explains spatial disorientation, icing, mechanical vulnerability, and the limits of small aircraft operating in marginal conditions. Flight data, when available, often reveals deviations that align with known hazards. When data is unavailable, models can still describe likely scenarios. These explanations do not require unknown forces. They rely on documented interactions between machines, humans, and environment. Search and rescue science explains why so little is sometimes found. Detection probabilities drop sharply in dense terrain. Scent dispersal is unreliable in cold and wind. Aerial visibility is limited by canopy, snow, and shadow. Statistical models show that even well-coordinated searches can miss targets repeatedly, especially when the search area is large and the target is small or stationary. Taken together, these explanations account for a great deal. They show that disappearances inside the Alaska Triangle do not require extraordinary causes. Ordinary risks applied consistently in an extreme environment are sufficient to produce extraordinary outcomes, and yet science also has boundaries. One limitation is data. Many disappearance cases lack precise information. There may be no GPS track, no flight recorder, no eyewitness account. Science depends on inputs. When those inputs are missing or incomplete, conclusions become probabilistic rather than definitive. Models can suggest what likely happened, but they cannot confirm it. Another limitation is reconstruction. Even when remains or wreckage are found, they often appear long after the event. Environmental processes may have altered the scene significantly. Injuries may be ambiguous. Damage patterns may be incomplete. Science can identify causes of death or mechanical failure, but it cannot always reconstruct the sequence of decisions that led there. Human behavior introduces further uncertainty. People do not always act rationally, even under normal conditions. Under stress, behavior becomes even less predictable. Science can describe general tendencies, but it cannot fully account for individual choices made in moments of fear, confusion, or desperation. These moments matter disproportionately in survival situations, yet they are the hardest to analyse after the fact. There is also the issue of compounding variables. Disappearances rarely result from a single factor. They emerge from combinations of weather, terrain, fatigue, equipment, timing, and judgment. Science can isolate these factors individually, but their interactions are complex. Small differences in timing or location can produce radically different outcomes. This sensitivity makes precise explanation difficult. Another boundary lies in scale. Alaska's vastness introduces statistical noise. With so much land and so few observers, rare events are harder to contextualize. Patterns may appear where none exist, or real patterns may be obscured by randomness. Science can address this through large data sets, but many cases are too unique to fit neatly into aggregated analysis. Science also struggles with absence. It is easier to explain what is present than what is missing. When no remains are found, no wreckage recovered, no signal detected, science can only infer. Inference is powerful, but it is not closure. It leaves space for doubt, not because science has failed, but because the environment has erased the evidence science would need. This gap between explanation and certainty is often where discomfort arises. People want definitive answers. Science offers likelihoods. It can say what probably happened, not what certainly did. For families, this distinction matters deeply. A probable explanation does not carry the same emotional weight as a confirmed one. It is important to recognize that science does not claim to explain everything. In fact, its strength lies in acknowledging uncertainty. When scientists say, "we do not know," they are not inviting speculation. They are marking the boundary between evidence and assumption. In the context of the Alaska Triangle, those boundaries are encountered frequently. Some questions remain open, not because they are unanswerable in principle, but because the opportunity to answer them has passed. Evidence degraded, signals were lost, locations were never identified. Time closed the window. Science cannot reverse that process. This does not mean that unexplained equals inexplicable. It means that explanation requires conditions that are not always available. In remote environments, those conditions are often absent. The persistence of unanswered cases has led some to suggest that science is missing something fundamental, that there is an unknown variable at play. While this idea is understandable, it is not supported by evidence. The known variables are sufficient to explain the risks. What is missing is not a new force, but complete information. Science also cannot fully address the emotional dimension of disappearance. It does not explain why certain cases linger in collective memory while others fade. It does not account for the way uncertainty reshapes communities or families. These are human experiences, not scientific problems. When science reaches its limits, it does not hand the problem to mystery. It leaves it unresolved. That unresolved space is uncomfortable, especially in a culture that expects answers. but it is also honest. Inside the Alaska Triangle, science explains a great deal. It explains how people get lost, how planes go down, how searches fail, and how environments erase traces. What it cannot always provide is a complete narrative. It cannot fill in every missing moment or restore what was never found. Understanding this distinction matters. It shifts the focus from searching for hidden explanations to recognizing the real constraints at work. It reframes the Alaska Triangle not as a place where science fails, but as a place where reality exceeds our ability to observe and document it fully. As we continue, turning toward why so many questions remain unanswered despite all of this knowledge, that distinction becomes central, because what goes missing here is not only people or planes, but certainty itself. And science, for all its power, does not promise certainty. It promises clarity where possible, and honesty where it is not. Questions remain unanswered inside the Alaska Triangle, for reasons that are far less dramatic than people often assume, yet far more stubborn. They persist not because no one is asking them, and not because no one is trying to answer them, but because the conditions required for answers rarely survive long enough to be examined. The land, the timing, and the nature of the events themselves work together to leave gaps that never quite close. One of the primary reasons is timing. Most disappearances unfold faster than systems can respond. A person goes missing between scheduled check-ins. A plane deviates from its route in a span of minutes. A weather system shifts earlier than expected. By the time concern turns into action, the critical moment has already passed. What remains is not the event itself, but its aftermath, already altered by environment and time. In many investigations elsewhere, answers come from sequences. Security footage captures movement. Witnesses observe transitions. Data logs record changes. Inside the Alaska Triangle, these sequences are often broken or absent entirely. There may be a last known location, but no continuous trail beyond it. Without continuity, reconstruction becomes speculative. Science can outline possible paths, but it cannot confirm which one occurred. Distance plays a quiet but decisive role. Help is rarely close. Observation is sparse. The gap between an incident and its discovery can stretch from hours to days, or from days to never. In that gap, evidence degrades rapidly. Snow falls, rivers rise, wind scatters, animals move through. What might have been clear at the moment of disappearance becomes indistinguishable from background. Another reason lies in how human systems prioritize resources. Search efforts, no matter how committed, are finite. They are constrained by safety, funding, weather, and manpower. When probability of success drops below a certain threshold, searches are scaled back or suspended. This is not indifference, it is triage. But it means that some questions are left unresolved by necessity rather than neglect. Records themselves introduce limits. Many cases date back decades, from periods when tracking technology was minimal or non-existent. Flight plans were less precise. Communication systems were less reliable. Documentation standards varied. When modern investigators revisit these cases, they are often working from fragments. Gaps in records become permanent gaps in understanding. Human memory adds another layer of uncertainty. Witness accounts are shaped by stress, time, and interpretation. Details shift, timelines blur. In environments where events are rare and impactful, memories may become sharper in some areas and less reliable in others. Investigators must weigh these accounts carefully, knowing that memory is not a recording device. There is also the problem of uniqueness. Each disappearance is shaped by its own combination of factors. Weather patterns differ, terrain changes, individual experience varies. This makes pattern recognition difficult. While similarities exist, they rarely align perfectly enough to produce a single explanatory framework. Instead of one answer, there are many partial ones. Public attention contributes in subtle ways. High-profile cases receive scrutiny. Others fade quietly. This uneven focus skews perception. It creates the impression that some disappearances are more mysterious than others, when in reality the difference often lies in documentation and media coverage rather than circumstance. Expectation also plays a role. People often expect answers to be definitive. They look for a single cause, a clear mistake, or a dramatic explanation. In reality, many outcomes emerge from cumulative error. Small decisions, each reasonable in isolation, align poorly under changing conditions. When no single moment stands out as the turning point, it becomes harder to label the cause. The environment itself resists narrative. It does not preserve scenes. It does not mark transitions. It does not highlight significance. A place where someone fell is indistinguishable from any other place once time has passed. Without environmental markers, human stories lose their anchors. Legal and administrative processes can also close doors unintentionally. Once a case is classified as accidental or undetermined, it may receive less ongoing attention. Files are archived. Personnel change. Institutional memory fades. Revisiting old cases requires motivation and resources that are not always available. There is also the uncomfortable reality that some questions may not have answers that feel meaningful. Knowing that someone likely succumbed to exposure does not explain every decision they made beforehand. Knowing that a plane probably crashed due to weather does not reveal its exact location. These explanations satisfy analytical curiosity, but leave emotional needs unmet. Unanswered questions persist because closure requires alignment between evidence, timing, and interpretation. Inside the Alaska Triangle, that alignment is rare. Too often, one element is missing. Sometimes all of them are. This does not mean the questions are ignored. They remain active in families, communities, and institutions. They resurface with each new disappearance, each recovered fragment, each rediscovered case file. But resurfacing is not resolution. The persistence of unanswered questions also reflects a broader human discomfort with uncertainty. In environments where unpredictability is high, uncertainty becomes a constant companion. Alaska does not promise clarity. It demands adaptation. Those who live there understand this, even if they wish it were otherwise. As we move forward, approaching what it means when a place does not provide answers, this context matters. The unanswered questions are not failures of curiosity or effort. They are the natural outcome of scale, timing, and environment interacting with human limits. Inside the Alaska Triangle, what remains unanswered is not always a mystery waiting to be solved. Sometimes it is simply the space left behind when answers were never possible to begin with. There is an expectation, often unspoken, that places eventually explain themselves, that if something happens often enough, patterns will emerge clearly. Causes will be named, warnings will be posted, lessons will be learned in ways that feel solid and transferable. Inside the Alaska Triangle, that expectation is repeatedly disappointed. Not because nothing can be learned, but because learning here does not arrive in tidy conclusions. Instead, it arrives as restraint, as caution, as an understanding of limits rather than answers. When a place does not give answers, it challenges how people relate to it. Modern societies are built on the idea that uncertainty can be reduced with enough data, enough observation, enough analysis. Roads are mapped, weather is forecast, risks are quantified. In many environments, this approach works well enough to create a sense of control. Alaska, particularly the regions associated with the triangle, interrupts that confidence. This interruption is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with spectacle. It appears quietly, when systems that usually provide clarity fall short, when a search yields nothing, when an investigation ends without resolution, when the best explanation available still leaves gaps that cannot be closed. Over time, these moments accumulate, and the place acquires a reputation not because it is unknowable, but because it does not cooperate with the human desire for certainty. What it means for a place not to give answers is not that it is hiding something. It is that it operates independently of human frameworks. The land does not organize itself around cause and effect narratives that are accessible to us. It responds to physics, climate, geology, and biology, all unfolding on scales that often exceed individual human experience. In practical terms, this means that actions do not always produce outcomes that can be traced cleanly. A person sets out with preparation and intention, and the outcome is still disappearance. A pilot follows procedure, and the flight still ends badly. A search is conducted thoroughly, and nothing is found. These outcomes resist moral interpretation. They do not imply fault or fate. They imply mismatch between expectation and reality. Living with that mismatch requires a shift in mindset. For those unfamiliar with such environments, unanswered questions feel intolerable. They demand explanation. They provoke speculation. They invite external narratives that impose meaning where none is evident. For those who live closer to the land, unanswered questions are often treated differently. They are acknowledged without being resolved. They become part of the background, not because they are forgotten, but because dwelling on them does not change the conditions that produced them. This difference in perspective is important. It shapes how stories are told and retold. Outsiders may frame the Alaska Triangle as mysterious or ominous. Locals may frame it as demanding or unforgiving. Both descriptions point to the same reality from different angles. The land does not adjust itself to human comfort. When a place doesn't give answers, responsibility shifts inward. Instead of relying on explanation after the fact, emphasis moves toward decision-making before the fact. Preparation, timing, knowing when not to go, knowing when to turn back. These practices do not guarantee safety, but they reflect an acceptance that prevention matters more than explanation. This acceptance can be difficult. It runs counter to narratives of mastery and progress. It suggests that some risks cannot be engineered away, that some environments retain the capacity to overwhelm even well-prepared individuals, that humility is not optional, but essential. The absence of answers also affects memory. In places where events are explained clearly, memory organizes itself around lessons learned. In places where answers are missing, memory organizes itself around cautionary awareness. Stories become less about what happened and more about what could happen. They function as reminders rather than explanations. This is evident in how disappearances inside the Alaska Triangle are discussed within communities. Names are remembered, locations are mentioned quietly, routes are reconsidered. These references are often brief without detail. The lack of answers does not diminish their impact, it sharpens it. There is also an ethical dimension to unanswered places. When answers are unavailable, there is a temptation to fill the gap with narratives that may not respect those involved. Sensational explanations can overshadow real risks. They can distract from practical lessons. They can turn human loss into entertainment rather than warning. Understanding what it means when a place doesn't give answers includes resisting that temptation. It involves sitting with uncertainty without needing to decorate it. This is uncomfortable, especially in cultures that equate understanding with control. But it is a necessary discomfort if the goal is safety rather than story. The Alaska Triangle does not ask to be mythologized. It does not benefit from being portrayed as supernatural or malevolent. Those portrayals may satisfy curiosity, but they do not improve outcomes. They can even make things worse by shifting attention away from real hazards and real limits. At the same time, refusing easy explanations does not mean dismissing emotion. The absence of answers is painful. It leaves families without closure. It leaves communities with unresolved loss. Acknowledging that pain is part of respecting what the place does not give back. A place that does not give answers forces a re-evaluation of what answers are for. In many cases, answers serve to restore order. They allow events to be filed away, understood, and moved past. When answers are absent, order is not restored. The event remains open-ended. That openness changes how people relate to risk going forward. In Alaska, this often leads to conservatism rather than complacency. People double-check weather, they leave itineraries, they pack for contingencies that seem excessive elsewhere. These behaviours are not expressions of fear, they are adaptations to an environment that has demonstrated its indifference repeatedly. This adaptation is not perfect. Disappearances still occur, accidents still happen. But the response to them is shaped by an understanding that explanation is not guaranteed. This understanding fosters respect rather than resentment toward the land. From a broader perspective, places that do not give answers challenge a fundamental assumption of modern life, that everything can be known if we try hard enough. Alaska quietly contradicts this assumption. It demonstrates that effort and knowledge have limits, that some outcomes remain unresolved not because of ignorance, but because of scale and complexity. This contradiction is uncomfortable, but it is also instructive. It reminds us that not all environments are designed for human clarity, that some systems operate beyond our capacity to monitor continuously, that some questions persist not because they are neglected, but because they are structurally resistant to resolution. As we approach the final stretch of this exploration, this understanding becomes central. The Alaska Triangle is not defined by what it hides, but by what it does not return. Not answers, not evidence, not certainty. It leaves behind silence, altered routines, and a heightened awareness of limits. What it means when a place doesn't give answers is not that the place is hostile. It means the place is honest. Honest about scale. Honest about risk. Honest about the boundaries of human control. And in that honesty, there is a lesson that extends beyond Alaska. It asks for humility in the face of systems larger than ourselves. It asks for preparation without expectation of rescue by explanation. It asks for respect that is grounded not in fear, but in recognition. As we move toward the final reflection, where everything discussed settles into a broader understanding, this perspective matters. Because what still goes missing inside the Alaska Triangle is not only people or planes. It is the reassurance that every story ends with answers. And learning to live without that reassurance may be one of the most difficult adaptations this place demands. There is a quiet moment that comes at the end of long journeys, not when something concludes neatly, but when motion slows enough for perspective to settle in. That is where we find ourselves now. After tracing vanished aircraft across empty sky, following footprints that fade into forest and snow, listening to silence where answers never arrived, and standing at the edge of what science can and cannot resolve, there is little left to chase. The wilderness does not respond to being pursued. It continues steadily and without pause, while those who observe it eventually stop moving and watch. Standing still in Alaska is not the same as standing still elsewhere. Even when a person does not move, the land does. Ice shifts. Water flows beneath frozen surfaces. Wind reshapes snowdrifts grain by grain. Trees creak and settle. Animals pass through unseen. The environment is never truly static, even when it appears calm. This is one of the most difficult ideas to accept when thinking about disappearance. The absence feels frozen in time, but the world around it is not. When someone goes missing inside the Alaska Triangle, the moment of loss becomes fixed in human memory. A last phone call, a departure time, a final sighting. These points remain sharp and unchanged. Meanwhile, the place where that moment occurred evolves immediately. Within hours, the physical context begins to dissolve. Within days, it becomes unfamiliar. Within years, it may be unrecognizable. Memory stands still. The wilderness moves on. This contrast explains much of the unease surrounding unresolved disappearances. Humans experience time narratively. Events are meant to lead somewhere. Causes are meant to connect to outcomes. Endings are meant to follow beginnings. Alaska interrupts that structure. It allows beginnings without endings, stories without conclusions. And in doing so, It reveals how dependent people are on narrative closure to make sense of loss. Standing still while the wilderness moves on also means accepting that attention fades, search parties leave, news cycles shift, resources are redirected. This is not cruelty. It is inevitability. No place, no matter how vast, can hold human focus indefinitely. What remains is memory, unevenly distributed among families, communities, and records. For families, standing still takes a different form. Life continues, but it does so around an absence that never resolves. Decisions are made without certainty. Rituals adapt. Grief exists without a fixed shape. The wilderness, indifferent to this process, continues to change. The place where someone vanished becomes less and less accessible, not just physically, but emotionally. Returning there may no longer feel possible or useful. Communities experience this stillness collectively. In small towns and villages, stories of disappearance settle into shared awareness. They are not discussed constantly, but they are not forgotten either. They resurface in moments of caution, in advice given to newcomers, in the way people plan trips and watch the weather. The wilderness moves on, but the lessons linger. For those who work in search and rescue, investigation, or aviation, standing still means carrying unresolved cases forward. It means knowing that effort does not guarantee outcome, that professionalism does not ensure success. This knowledge reshapes how future decisions are made. Conservative choices gain weight. Margins are widened. The cost of overconfidence becomes personal rather than abstract. From a broader perspective, the Alaska Triangle forces a reconsideration of how modern societies think about safety and control. There is an assumption that with enough technology, enough data, and enough coordination, risk can be managed down to negligible levels. Alaska challenges that assumption. It does not reject technology, but it demonstrates its limits clearly. Standing still in this context does not mean resignation. It means realism. It means acknowledging that some environments operate on scales that exceed human oversight, that some risks cannot be fully mitigated, that some losses cannot be undone or fully explained. This is not a failure of progress. It is a boundary condition. The wilderness moving on is not a statement. It is a process. It does not pause for reflection or adjust its behaviour in response to human emotion. Rivers will continue to flow through places where people were last seen. Snow will continue to fall on ground once searched meticulously. Planes will continue to cross skies layered with unseen histories. Life, human and otherwise, continues alongside absence. This continuation can feel unsettling. It may seem as though the land is indifferent to loss, but indifference is not malice, it is neutrality. The environment does not assign meaning. Meaning is created by those who observe it. When the wilderness moves on, it does so without judgment. Understanding this helps shift the way the Alaska Triangle is framed. It is not a place that takes people. It is a place where human vulnerability is exposed without mediation, where systems designed for observation and recovery reach their limits, where outcomes are shaped by timing, scale, and cumulative risk rather than intention. Standing still also invites reflection on why certain places capture imagination more than others. Disappearances occur everywhere. Accidents happen daily across the world. Yet the Alaska Triangle holds attention because it resists resolution consistently. It offers no single explanation to latch onto, no villain, no mechanism that fully satisfies curiosity. This resistance creates space for projection. Some fill it with fear, others with speculation, others with respect. The most grounded response tends to be restraint, an understanding that not all questions demand answers in order to inform behaviour. That caution does not require complete explanation. Those who live and work in Alaska often embody this response. They plan carefully, they leave itineraries, they carry extra supplies, they turn back early. These habits are not dramatic, they are quiet adjustments to reality. Standing still in this sense means pausing long enough to recognize when forward motion is no longer wise. The phrase, standing still while the wilderness moves on, also applies to perspective. Human attention fixes on specific moments of loss. The land holds those moments only briefly. Over time, it absorbs them into broader cycles. This does not erase significance, it contextualizes it. Seen from that distance, disappearances inside the Alaska Triangle are not anomalies. They are outcomes produced at the intersection of vast space, volatile conditions, limited observation, and human limits. Each case is unique. The pattern lies not in cause, but in context. What still goes missing inside the Alaska Triangle, then, is not only people or machines, it is certainty. It is the reassurance that effort will always produce understanding. It is the belief that every environment can be rendered legible with enough tools. Alaska quietly contradicts that belief. This contradiction does not make the place hostile or mystical. It makes it honest. Honest about scale. Honest about unpredictability. Honest about the fact that humans are not the primary reference point in every system. Standing still long enough to absorb that honesty is uncomfortable but instructive. As this exploration slows, there is no final revelation waiting. No hidden mechanism revealed at the last moment. No solution that resolves every disappearance. That absence is intentional, because it mirrors the reality of the place itself. Alaska does not conclude its stories, it allows them to remain open. For those listening, wherever you are, there is likely comfort in distance. The Alaska Triangle exists far north, far away, bordered by unfamiliar terrain and conditions. But the lesson it offers is not confined to geography. It speaks to how humans relate to uncertainty more broadly. There are places, situations, and moments in life where answers do not arrive, where effort does not lead to clarity, where standing still becomes the only option, while circumstances continue to shift around you. Alaska provides a physical example of this dynamic, but it is not unique in principle. The difference is that Alaska does not soften the experience. It presents it plainly. You adapt or you don't. You prepare or you don't. You respect limits or you encounter them directly. The wilderness moves on regardless. In that sense, the Alaska Triangle is less a mystery than a mirror. It reflects back human expectations and shows where they fracture. It reveals how much certainty people rely on and how destabilizing its absence can be. It also shows that life continues even when stories do not resolve. Standing still at the edge of that realization does not require fear. It requires adjustment, a shift away from demanding explanations and toward respecting conditions, a willingness to accept that some environments, some losses, and some questions will remain unanswered. And as the wilderness continues to move on, unchanged by attention or analysis, it leaves behind a quieter understanding. That survival is not guaranteed by confidence. That disappearance is not always dramatic. That preparation matters, but humility matters more. So wherever you are listening from, in whatever time zone, in whatever conditions surround you, the story does not end here. It does not conclude with certainty or closure. It simply slows, allowing space for reflection before attention drifts elsewhere. The land remains, the sky remains, the unanswered questions remain. And somewhere within that vastness, the Alaska Triangle continues to exist not as a single place, but as a reminder of how small the space of certainty can be when set against environments that do not pause to explain themselves. Standing still is not defeat, it is recognition. And sometimes, recognition is the most complete response available when the wilderness keeps moving on.